Hello and welcome to our presentation on artificial cranial deformation in migration period in early medieval Central Europe. Today we want to present you our latest findings from our excavation in Theiss, located in eastern Austria. But to begin with, let's take a look at the definition and the implications of artificial cranial modification. Artificial cranial modification is a permanent and irreversible manner of body modification performed on infants. The human head is altered in a way that is perceived to be aesthetically pleasing or desirable within a respective community. It is usually understood to be a representation of social affiliation, status, or even spiritual notions. The procedure of cranial modification must be started within a few days or weeks after birth, as long as the fontanelles and the cranial sutures are not closed and the general shape of the skull is flexible. The desired form can be achieved by applying external pressure on the infant's head, using boards, bandages, or special headgear. While it affects the morphology of the cranium and the cranial vault, it does not affect the growth of brain volume and in most cases does not interfere with physical or mental health. However, it is important to note that a deformation of the skull can be caused by different reasons that are not always based on intentional actions. The cranial shape can also deform unintentionally if, for example, a baby wears tight head caps or sleeps with the head turned to the same side during the first months of life, which is usually referred to as positional plagiocephaly and depicted on the graph in the middle. Deviating cranial shapes can in this case be an indicator for infant care practices, but there are also anatomical reasons for skull deformations caused by a variety of diseases, congenital malformations, or premature closing of the sutures. The adult individual on the right presents, for example, a case of acrocephaly, where the premature closing of the lambdoid and coronal suture leads to an elongated and somehow egg-like shape of the skull. Cranial deformations are known to be found globally and arose independently at multiple points of time throughout human history. The oldest finds of intentional skull deformation in Europe already date to the 2nd century AD and were found in the Pannonian Basin, which comprises of present-day Austria, Hungary, Romania, Serbia, Slovakia, Croatia, and Slovenia, and these were associated with influences coming from the east. The practice eventually became widespread during the Great Migration period from the late 4th to 6th century AD. Based on archaeological evidence, it is speculated that the migration of the Huns, an inhomogeneous group of Eurasian nomads, introduced the habit of artificial cranial modification to Central Europe, where it was also favored by Alan, Gothic, Langobard, Gepidic, or Sarmatian populations in the Pannonian Plain region. Eventually, the habit spread into the West, and burials with cranial modifications are also found in Germany, Switzerland, and France. The demographic distribution of burials with artificially modified skulls displays various age and gender-specific changes on both a temporal and spatial level. In the area of the Pannonian Plain, modified skulls are found on both sexes and across all age groups, mostly dating to the time between the early 5th and even the early 7th century. However, the finds of children with cranial deformation only date from the early 5th to the mid-5th century, and there are so far no infant burials that have been dated to the 6th century or later. In Bavarian burials of the late 5th, early 6th century and elsewhere in Western Europe, this cultural phenomenon is mainly restricted to adult females, which allows conclusions on the timescale of East-West migration, cultural diffusion, and possibly a higher degree of female mobility. But now let's move on to our case study example with a short summary of the excavation. Within the distribution area of early medieval artificial cranial modification, the site of Theiss lies on the western edges on the Pannonian Plain, marked with the red star. Overall, there are 26 sites with a total of 54 artificially deformed skulls on the territory of today's Austria, with Theiss being the most recently added point to this distribution map. The excavation in Theiss was carried out from 2020 to 2023, unearthing almost 10,000 archaeological features from multiple periods on an area of 42,000 square meters. The oldest features are from the Middle Bronze Age, dating to the 2nd century BC, and the most intense phase of occupation was during the Hallstatt period from 800 to 450 BC. There are also numerous structures dating to the Iron Age, the time of the Roman Empire, and the subsequent century of the migration period as the first phase of the early Middle Ages. The early medieval occupation is not only represented by several pit houses that were excavated, but also through a small burial group consisting of only 8 inhumation burials. Their location on the site is marked with the red square. The buried individuals were 4 adult women and 4 children under 6 years. They were all buried in supine position in what now seem to be shallow grave pits. With one exception, all burials were found disturbed, with some being in a poor state of preservation. The burials were equipped with typical grave goods such as glass and amber beads, fibulae, headdress rings, pottery, spindle whorls, knives, and other iron objects. A selection of them you can see in the picture. Based on their typochronological classification, the burials were dated to the 5th century AD. Grave 63 contained the skeletal remains of a 3 to 5-year-old child that were found completely dislocated. With the burial, we found a small drop-shaped and probably retouched rock, a piece of bone that also showed tool marks, and a small silverish glass bead. Only at a second glance, this burial revealed itself as the most striking find of that very small cemetery. In the course of anthropological analysis, we noticed that the frontal bone was somehow deformed and bulged. After taping all individual bones of the skull together, it seemed clear that the head of the infant was artificially deformed, most likely using bandages, as indicated by the indentions on the frontal bone, similar to the shape depicted in the graph below. On the left picture, we can see that the morphology of the frontal bone of individual 63 differs significantly compared to the regularly shaped model of a skull of a same-aged child. From a lateral viewpoint, the forehead has a terrace-like appearance, almost forming a crest on the top of the head. Also, the frontal bone and the parietal bones are slightly thickened. As the coronal suture, the joint between frontal bone and the parietal bones, was not fused at the time of death, we can assume that the shape of the skull did not reach its final appearance and might have undergone further deformation. The endocranial surface of the frontal bone shows deepened and increased digitate impressions, highlighted with the red arrow. That can be assigned to a constant high intracranial pressure. These are morphological changes that are commonly observed in unintentionally but also in intentionally deformed skulls. Other pathological alterations, such as endocranial lesions that are otherwise frequently observed on individuals with deformed skulls, have not been found. However, during basic anthropological assessment of age, we noticed that there is a discrepancy between the dental and long bone age. While the age estimation based on long bone dimension revealed an age span from 1.5 to 2 years at death, the dental eruption and development rather suggests a higher age of 3.5 to 5 years. As growth and maturation are strongly influenced by environmental factors, such as nutritional basis or health status, dental development is less affected by these, which is why tooth development are the most reliable methods for aging subadult individuals. The noted discrepancy between dental and long bone age might thus be an indicator of physical stress, such as malnutrition or disease. The finds from the Pannonian Basin, including the presented skull from Theiss, are currently being investigated as part of the ERC Synergy Grant Project Histogenes. This project aims to decode different waves of migration into Central Europe on the threshold from late antiquity to the early Middle Ages, supported by biochemical analysis of several thousand burials found in this region. As the evaluation of morphological sex through macroscopic analysis of subadult skeletons is unreliable, we hope that the conducted aDNA analysis will not only reveal the genetic background of the individuals, but also the sex of the infant buried in grave 63 and the other infants excavated on the site for further gender-related inquiries. Artificial cranial modifications in migration period in early medieval Central Europe constitute a frequently discussed, yet not fully understood phenomenon of bioarchaeological investigation. Through the implementation of biomolecular analysis, we hope to gain new insights into biocultural diffusion and population dynamics of post-antique Eastern Austria. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us.